Thank you for joining us here on France 24. It's been 4 months since Hamas carried out an attack in southern Israel, claiming the lives of nearly 1,200 people. Militants also took around 250 civilians hostage, including many foreign nationals. Now, today, the French President Emmanuel Macron is holding a tribute to victims of Hamas's attacks in Israel. 42 French citizens were killed and 3 remain hostage in Gaza. Joining me in the studio is France 24's Oliver Farry from our International Affairs Desk, as well as Joseph Downing, Senior Lecturer in Politics and International Relations at Aston University. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us here on the program today. Oliver, I want to start with you because we have this ceremony which is going to be held, kicking off in a couple of minutes' time. What's this about?
Well, it is commemorating the 42 French hostages who died during the Hamas attacks on October 7th. Actually, 41 of them died on October 7th. One of them died in captivity in Gaza afterwards. This is 4 months on from the attack. Emmanuel Macron has pledged to basically commemorate those victims. They're not all French-born. Some of them are French citizens are born to French people who are living in Israel, but the government is saying that it's very much in line with the fight against anti-Semitism. Emmanuel Macron himself was actually criticised for not attending the march against anti-Semitism on November 12th. There has been a spike in anti-Semitic incidents in France over the past 4 months. So the government is, on the one hand, showing solidarity in a Republican ceremony, as they say, with France's Jewish population. Of course, remember, France has the largest Jewish population in Europe, and also is showing solidarity with Israel, even though France has been certainly less devoted, so to speak, than, say, other countries such as Germany, the UK and the United States in its support for Israel. It has been certainly more critical. Macron has also called for a ceasefire several times over the past few months, but he is very much showing that there is solidarity with Israel at this time.
Joseph Downing, I'd like to bring you in now. France is holding this ceremony today, 4 months after the October 7th attacks, but we haven't seen any official ceremonies being held in the United States, even in Israel for that matter. In Israel, they just held a minute of silence. So why is France doing this?
France is doing this because it is the foreign country that lost the most citizens on the October 7th brutal attacks by Hamas. So this is something that's affected France deeply. And also, France has, as your previous contributor said, has the largest Jewish population in Europe, and a population which is actually shrinking. And in some ways is shrinking because of an increase in people emigrating to Israel because they don't feel safe in France anymore. So you have situations where previous jihadist attacks, whether it's the Hyper Kasher supermarket attack, whether it's the Toulouse attacks that targeted a Jewish school, the jihadist attacks that we've seen in France in the past kind of 10, 20 years have also targeted French Jews, right? So there's this worry of an intrusion of international politics into the context of France and destabilizing France, especially for its Jewish citizens. Now, there's an issue here, right? Because France has, if we look back even to the Dreyfus affair, France has, issues of anti-Semitism even prior to the emergence of jihadist, radical sort of political Islam within France. So it's something that France has had to constantly combat. France, under the Vichy regime, under occupation during the Second World War, deported a huge number of its Jews to extermination camps. And in fact, many of the Jews that you see in France today are descended from those that left France's previous North African colonies of Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia in the middle of the 20th century as those colonies gained independence, as the state of Israel was born, and as those individuals felt they were no longer safe in those North African countries. So you can see that there's a really complex intersection of international politics, identity and security with the question of terror attacks against French Jews on French soil. It isn't just an issue kind of within France. There are much bigger kind of trends at play here. And I think the French government is right to be vocal in its solidarity with France's Jewish community, especially considering the massive spike in anti-Semitic attacks, which have more than doubled in the previous year in France.
I'd like to bring you in, Oliver, because as Joseph mentioned there, we have a sizable Jewish community here in France, but also France has a sizable Arab minority. Because of that, since the 7th of October, there has been this huge division. This whole France's policies towards either Israel or Gaza have been very divisive in this country. Talk us through some of the things which we've seen and witnessed here.
Well, what we see at this is a Republican ceremony today, so the protocol brings together pretty much all parties in the National Assembly. One of those is the France Unbowed party on the left of the French political spectrum. Now, the France Unbowed has been criticised over the past few months for its refusal to call the October 7th attacks a terrorist attack, and their leader Jean-Luc Mélenchon has had a rather not a very coherent defence of that, because he says that he doesn't want to. He wants to wait until the attackers are convicted for war crimes, so to speak. Now, well, the attackers won't be convicted of anything because many of them are dead. They died on that particular day. Also, it's never going to be tried as a war crime. Like it is recognised as a terrorist attack by pretty much all countries. So that is one side of the division. Their presence today may not be welcomed by a number of the families of the victims. However, Manuel Bompard, the leader of the France Unbowed, says that their party has the right to be indignant at attacks like October 7th as well. French Muslims also will, many of them, and I've heard this myself when covering pro-Palestinian marches over the past few months, is that there always is official France, including the government and the media, is more concerned about the lives of Israelis than it is about the lives of Palestinians. And there's over 27,000 have died over the past 4 months in Gaza. Generally, in these situations, you will always have a counter from the other side. Israelis will say the same thing as well they will couch the war in Gaza, saying, "Well, this is what happened. They attacked us on October 7th, and we had to respond." A lot of people would say that is not necessarily the same proportion, but certainly French Muslims will look at today. I mean, obviously not all French Muslims, but there will be ones who have a leaning towards Palestine, who will think that, well, France is showing official solidarity with Israel. Where is the official solidarity with Gaza? Whether they're right or not to do that today is another thing.
Joseph, your thoughts on that? Because what Oliver mentioned is kind of true. We do have 27,000 people who have been killed in Gaza, Palestinians, many of them women and children who are not Hamas terrorists. How will this ceremony be viewed beyond France's Jewish community?
Yeah, I mean, this is a really important point, right? And one that is unfortunate because there's a question here of citizens and non-citizens, right? Unfortunately, the Palestinian children and women are not French citizens. And I think that's where the division here exists. This is not a ceremony necessarily for Israelis per se, but for dual nationals that are actually French citizens, right? So it would look pretty strange if France didn't hold some kind of ceremony for basically its citizens that have been killed abroad. Now, the French Muslim question is a very interesting one. It's something that I've written a book on. And it's easy to paint the French Muslim community as being one that's kind of anti-Semitic and hostile to Jews. But this is really not the case, right? People have much more nuanced and complex opinions about these issues. They may have issues with Israel. Many of them do. Many non-Muslim French people have issues, as many British people have issues, right, with the conduct of the Israeli government and a lack of recognition of an independent Palestinian state. But this doesn't mean that they go around and beat up and attack and murder their Jewish neighbours. I mean, if you go where I live in Marseille, or you go to Paris, to Sarcelles, places like that, Jews and Muslims live side by side. You have very visible Muslims, you have very visible Jews. They go into each other's shops. I mean, the situation is not quite as fraught, thankfully, actually, as it may seem on the surface. This is not to say that there's not a problem with anti-Semitism in the French Muslim community, because there clearly is, but there is also a problem in all communities, right, across much of Europe in terms of anti-Semitic rhetoric and thought. So I think that's where the issue is, and I think it's unfortunate. I mean, that, you know, those that are citizens are commemorated and those that are not citizens aren't. But unfortunately, that's just the way that the nation-state system works.
Oliver, we see on our screen there images of the French President Emmanuel Macron, who has arrived at the Invalides alongside the First Lady Brigitte Macron. Talk us through some of the other faces you've noticed here. We saw the Prime Minister there, Gabriel Attal, standing in line to welcome the President.
Yeah, Gabriel Attal, of course, is, though he's not Talmudically Jewish as would be the case. His father is Jewish, not his mother, but he does certainly identify with a Jewish heritage. There are a number of other figures there. Of course, we saw former President François Hollande. Just beside François Hollande, there actually was the French Jewish writer Marek Alter, who is quite known for his initiatives, ecumenical cross-community initiatives, and has visited Gaza on a number of occasions since 2007. And he is definitely somebody who would be a critical voice of Israel within France's Jewish community. We also saw many of the politicians across most French parties. It's very much a who's who of French political figures there today.
And let's talk about, since this conflict broke out and what we've seen in Gaza, Israel's operation. France, of course, was one of the countries that called for a ceasefire pretty early on. It took the French President Emmanuel Macron about over 30 days, I believe, and there were some 7,000 Palestinians killed. Emmanuel Macron organized a conference here on the eve of the Paris Peace Forum kicking off, and then he called for a ceasefire after he heard what was going on the ground. Where does France stand when it comes to a two-state solution?
France does support a two-state solution, like much of the European Union. It has never really brought much to bear in order to bring this about, mainly because it's definitely a hard thing to do. You can't just simply will it into power. It doesn't have an awful lot of leverage over Israel in order to bring it about, but it certainly does stand for a two-state solution.
Joseph Downing, before the ceremony kicks off, I just wanted to ask you about leverage vis-a-vis Israel, because it seems that a lot of European countries, France included, can call for things like a ceasefire, like potentially a two-state solution down the line, but at the end of the day, Israel tends to listen to one country in particular, and that's the United States.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, the US is essentially power broker, right? In Israel, the largest supplier of weapons, economic support. You've got a huge number of Americans ready to financial citizens go between the two countries. But I mean, Israel is also an independent sovereign state, right? And unfortunately, under the Netanyahu government, two-state solution has really essentially gone. You see the increasing number of settlements in the West Bank. They've rendered the West Bank an unviable as part of an independent Palestinian state, and that's really a tragedy. And the problem here is that there's no easy solution, even if the international community calls for a two-state solution, even if they boycotted Israeli goods or whatever you can do. Many have mentioned this, similar to measures taken against South Africa for apartheid, but the reality on the ground has changed, and it's changed dramatically in the past 10 or 15 years, to a point where it's very difficult to see how an viable, independent Palestinian state can be created. What's essentially left of the West Bank, and now what's essentially left of essentially a destroyed Gaza. And that really is the tragedy here.
I just want to tell our viewers what we're seeing on screen. We see members of the Republican Guard here at the Invalides as France pays homage to the 42 French citizens who were killed one after another. We've had a Republican Guard come out and hold a picture of a French victim. Clearly, a very moving ceremony there, Oliver, for people who have in fact lost loved ones in those October 7th attacks.
Yeah, there are. Emmanuel Macron has invited the families over from Israel. He flew them over on or France flew them over on a chartered jet. They are. It's particularly moving. These victims died in diverse circumstances. Some of them were attending the music festival in the south of Israel. Some of them were killed in the kibbutzim, and then there were others. Several were actually serving in the Israeli military the day of the attack as well. As I said earlier, some of them were born in France, but the vast majority of them are dual nationals who were born to French citizens who made aliyah, so to speak, and went to Israel over the past 20, 30 years. So it is very much, it's a solemn ceremony. It's also, interestingly enough, it's the first ceremony of its kind that has been held by any country since October 7th. And as Joseph said earlier, the main reason for it is presumably that France had more of its nationals killed in the October 7th attacks. And it also has, as I said, a sizable Jewish minority as well.
Joseph, after holding a ceremony like this, I know you said, of course, that one of the purposes of... We're going to take a listen now to the ceremony. Something about the ceremony being the first of its kind.
La cour des Invalides est trop étroite.
The Invalides is indeed too
4
small a
mois,
place.
jour pour jour,
4 months to the day
après.
after.
Car nous sommes 68 millions de Français
There are
endeuillés
68
par les
million
attaques
French people
terroristes
who
du
are
7 octobre dernier.
grieving after the
68
attacks
millions,
of last October
moins 42 vies
7th.
fauchées. 68 millions,
68 million French
dont 6
people
vies
grieving
blessées.
for the 42
68
citizens who
millions,
lost their lives, 68
dont
million
4
grieving
vies à jamais
for
meurtries par leur
the
captivité.
4 French hostages that have been freed,
68 millions,
68 million
dont 3 vies sont encore
grieving for the
prisonnières,
3 hostages that
pour
are
la
still
libération desquels nous
held
luttons
prisoner,
chaque jour.
and we're working for
Leurs
their
chaises
liberation every day.
sont là.
They're represented here by the 3 empty
Orient,
chairs.
Aurat,
Orient, Orat,
Ofer.
Ofer.
Les visages des suppliciés du 7
The
octobre
faces of those tortured on the 7th of October are a mirror to us.
dans chacun d'eux.
We see ourselves
De
in
ce
their
que nous étions,
faces,
de ce que nous serons à
what we
leurs
were,
âges.
what we had been at their age, and what they will never be able to live now.
Ils n'avaient pas 20 ans.
Many of them were not even 20 years old.
Noya, comme Nathan, ne les
Noya,
auront jamais.
Nathan will never be 20 years
Leurs
old.
traits qui s'affirment,
We see their
leurs questions qui se
faces,
bousculent, Dieu,
the questions that they had as young people about God, life, the world,
les hésitations et l'irrévérence,
their doubts,
leurs regards comme des
their
interrogations, leurs sourires en
irreverence,
forme de
their
promesses,
questions,
mémoire
their
de nos propres adolescents.
smiles full of promises, their burgeoning
Ils n'avaient pas 30
adolescence.
ans.
Some were under 30.
Avidan, Valentin
Avidan, Valentin,
ou Naomi ne les auront jamais.
Naomi will never be 30 years old.
Des rêves plein la tête, des études
They were
de
full
droit
of
ou
dreams. They were
d'informatique,
studying law,
métier,
computer sciences. They
un
were
grand
dreaming
amour.
of a career, of great love.
des fiançailles,
They
la
were
foi ou
planning
l'athéisme,
to become
une guitare,
engaged.
une planche de surf sur les vagues de la
They
Méditerranée,
loved their guitar.
des
They
idéaux
loved
dans la haute
surfing
du monde,
in the Mediterranean Sea. They had ideals and visions of
ils
a
étaient
better
dans la
world.
force de l'âge. Céline,
They were full of life and vigor. Céline,
Elias,
Marc,
ne
Elias
vieilliront pas.
will never grow old.
Leur chemin frayé a pris d'efforts, peuplé de projets,
They
d'amis,
worked hard
d'enfants
to
parfois.
build their projects. They had
Et ce
friends.
sourire
Some of
qui
them
n'aura
had
pas eu le temps de
children.
marquer leur visage. Ils avaient les tempes grises.
Some of them were older,
Carmela, Jean-Paul,
with the gray hair.
Yaffa,
Camilla,
elles
Jean-Paul,
ne
Yaffa.
grandiront plus.
No more gray
Leurs
hairs
voix
will
résonnent
come.
encore en hébreu comme en français.
We still hear their
Leurs voix
voices
qui
in
se cassaient
Hebrew
par
and in
moments de
French.
tendresse ou de
Their
pudeur,
voices sometimes
transmettant
broken
des
with
récits puisés au fond des âges
tenderness.
que leur avaient livrés leurs propres grands-parents.
They were transmitting the wisdom that they had learned from their own grandparents. We see their faces now,
Interrompus.
lives interrupted,
Des histoires de famille où s'entrebâillait parfois un
family
couple indicible
stories
et où,
are
comme l'odeur de
suddenly
l'espérance,
broken
le parfum
apart,
des collines de Jérusalem se mêlait
and
à
around the
celui des
hills of
sous-bois
Jerusalem,
d'Île-de-France ou des ruelles du
we
Vieux-Port.
hear the cries of people mixed with cries from
Le 7
people
octobre dernier,
in France as well. Last
l'aube,
7th of October, at the dawn
l'indicible
of
a
the
ressurgi
day,
des profondeurs de
the
l'histoire.
unspeakable happened. reaching out from the
Il était
black
6
depths of
heures
history. It was
au
6
festival
in the
Nova,
morning
à
at the
quelques
Nova
kilomètres de
Festival,
la bande de Gaza,
just a few kilometers from Gaza Strip,
où sous les banderoles et le ciel qui pâlissait,
under the
s'achevaient
pale
24 heures de fête et de
sky.
retrouvailles.
24 hours of
Les jeunes
festivities
qui
had
dansaient
just
là ne savaient
concluded.
pas qu'ils
The
étaient
young people
dans
were
la mâchoire
dancing
de la
there,
mort,
and they did not
déjà.
know that the jaws of death were about to close upon
Des
them.
voitures, des motos hérissées d'armes
Cars,
allaient fondre sur eux.
motorcycles, loaded with weapons,
Il était 6 heures.
fell upon them. It was 6
Et le
o'clock in the
Hamas
morning,
lança,
and
par
Hamas
surprise,
launched a
l'attaque
surprise
massive
attack,
et
a
odieuse,
massive and odious
le
attack,
plus grand massacre
the
antisémite
biggest
de notre siècle.
anti-Semitic massacre of our century.
Et dans les notes de musique d'un lieu de fête
And
ont éclaté les tambours de l'enfer. Et les
mixed in
téléphones
with
de nos
the
enfants qui
music of the
jusque-là
festival, we
filmaient
heard the
les joies de
drums
leur
of
vie
hell.
sont devenus les boîtes noires de
Young
l'horreur.
people were
Elles nous
filming
montreront
the joyful moments of their life, and these films
le
turned
ciel
into moments
livide
of
qui se zèbre
horror.
de missiles,
The sky was
les brigades
filled with
infernales qui
rockets.
écument le festival
The infernal
se répandent dans les
brigades
plaines, puis
fell
dans les
upon the
villages,
festival, spread across
fracassent
the
les
plains
portes,
and the villages,
font
broke
irruption dans
open
les
doors,
foyers, dans
broke
les
into
champs,
homes,
sous les
into
lits.
bedrooms,
Les
looked under
déflagrations,
beds.
les cris de
Fires were set.
massacrons les
There were
Juifs, les
cries
grenades,
of
les hurlements,
killing.
les
There
pleurs,
were screams.
silence.
There were people weeping, and then there
Comme
was
un linceul.
silence. Silence like a shroud.
Le silence
Silence.
face à l'indicible,
Silence in the face of the
Sidération.
unspeakable. Sideration
face à la sauvagerie,
facing
les larmes
barbarism. Tears
face à la barbarie,
facing this savage attack. Barbarism.
celle qui brûle et qui brise,
Br-
qui abuse et
burning,
qui tue,
breaking,
celle qui
abusing,
déchire les familles,
killing,
abat une
tearing
petite fille
families
parce qu'elle
apart,
ralentit la
killing
colonne, happe sur
a
son chemin un
young
enfant
girl
en pyjama,
because she was
en tue
slowing
un autre,
things
au creux
down,
même des bras de
grabbed a
son père.
child in pajamas
Celle qui
right
nie la
out of
joie,
the arms of her
l'art,
fathers.
la culture, la liberté de la fête.
After the joy and
Et
the
le cœur se
freedom
serre
of a
aux échos du
festival
Bataclan, de
came
Nice,
this horror, and we think about events in the Bataclan in Paris, in Nice, in Strasbourg,
celle
the
qui fauche
barbarism
cette
of these
jeunesse à peine
attacks
éclose,
that
qui ravage ces kibboutz souvent forts de convictions
takes the life of
pacifistes,
young people as
prêts à
they've
entendre
barely
la
begun
souffrance
to live,
palestinienne que les terroristes
We
ont piétinée en
are
prétendant
ready
la
to
défendre.
hear of Palestinian
La barbarie,
suffering, and yet this barbarity
celle qui se nourrit
seems
d'antisémitisme,
to mask that. This is a barbarity that feeds on anti-Semitism and that spreads anti-Semitism. It seeks to
et qui pourtant ne peut
annihilate
empêcher
and
des rayons de lumière au milieu
destroy.
de la nuit. Les messages d'adieu
And nonetheless, there were
de ces jeunes
certain
qui savent qu'ils vont mourir.
symbols of hope and light in this dark night. Young people who sent a last message to their parents, messages of love and thanks.
S'interpose entre
A
l'explosion d'une
man
grenade et ses 2 enfants,
who threw
sauvant leur
himself
vie
over a
au prix de
grenade
la
to save the life of his 2 children, costing him his
Et le
own life,
sacrifice de cet
and
autre
the
père,
sacrifice of
qui
another
n'était pas sur les
father,
lieux de l'attaque et qui,
who
quand il a
wasn't
reçu l'appel
on
de
the
sa
site of the
fille,
attack, but
prise
when
sous le
he
feu des tirs à Nova,
heard from his daughter by
a sauté dans
telephone,
sa voiture
he
pour aller la
immediately
chercher,
jumped in his car
allant
to go
au-devant de la
find her
mort.
and found death instead.
La barbarie et nos
Barbarism
lumières.
faced with light.
Car ceux qui tuent par haine
Because those who kill out of hatred
trouveront toujours face à eux
will always find
ceux qui sont prêts à mourir par
those who
amour.
are ready to die for love.
Et toujours ils verront s'élever
And
contre
always
notre
they will
pays
see
qui ce 7 octobre
that
a été touché dans sa chair.
those who were touched by the 7th of October in
Montpellier
their
à Tel
very
Aviv,
flesh, from Montpellier to
de
Tel
Bordeaux
Aviv,
au Negev,
from
les
Bordeaux
morts
to the
français
Negev
du 7
desert,
octobre
the French
n'étaient pas
citizens who
tous
died in
nés
the 7th of October
sur le sol de France.
were not all born in
Ils ne
France,
sont pas tombés sous le ciel de France.
and they did not die under French
Mais ils étaient de
skies,
France.
but they were
De
French.
France parce qu'ils la portaient
French
en eux.
because
Et
they
que notre
carried a
pays
love for
était
France
partout où
in
ils
their
étaient.
hearts.
De France parce qu'ils avaient l'exigence de
Because
l'idéal.
They
le goût de
held
l'universel.
ideals and values that are
De
universal.
France parce qu'ils aimaient notre
From
pays
France
avec
because
la
they
force
loved our
ardente de
country
ceux qui,
with
en
an
apprenant
ardent
sa langue,
love.
se plongeant dans
They
sa
learned
culture,
our language.
jamais.
They loved our culture
Et
and
ensuite,
lived with it constantly. And today at the
sur
Invalides,
notre
in
sol
this
que certains
courtyard,
n'avaient jamais foulé,
We welcome family members, some of whom had never been here before, and their faces are with us.
rappelant l'évidence de leur vie,
Let us remember their
la
lives.
trace ineffaçable qu'ils laissent dans les nôtres
They have left their mark on our
pour
lives
l'éternité.
for all time.
Leurs destins ne sont pas les seuls
Their
que le déchirement du Moyen-Orient
destinies
continue
were
de
not the
broyer.
only
Dans cette
destinies that
tornade de
were
souffrance qu'est
broken
la guerre.
by the tornado of suffering that is
Toutes les vies
war
se
in the Middle
valent
East.
inestimables
All
aux yeux de la
lives
France.
are worth
Et les vies que nous
life.
honorons aujourd'hui sont tombées, victimes d'un terrorisme
victims
que nous
of a
combattons sous toutes
terrorism
ses formes
against which we fight in all
et qui nous a
forms
frappés en plein cœur.
and which has stricken us at our heart.
La France recueillant ses
France
enfants parmi d'autres de ses
welcomes
enfants dont elle
Our
n'oublie
children
aucun.
home, and we do not forget any of our
Refusant les
children.
séparations comme les divisions.
We refuse separation and
Refusant
division.
l'esprit de mort, de
We
chaos et de
refuse
clivage
the spirit of
que nourrissent
death, of
précisément
chaos,
les
and
terroristes.
division, which is exactly what the terrorists hope to
Jamais
spread.
nous,
Never
nous ne laisserons prospérer
will
l'esprit
we
de
enable
revanche.
the spirit of revenge to be nurtured
Et dans ces
within our
moments de
hearts.
deuil,
And in these
dans les
moments of
épreuves du
grief,
temps, rien
these difficult
jamais
times,
ne
nothing
doit nous diviser.
will ever divide us.
La France restera unie
France will remain
pour elle-même et
united
pour les autres.
for ourselves
Unie
and
pour
for
se tenir
others,
au-delà des
united
destins et des différences au sein de notre
to look
nation.
beyond the
Unis dans
differences
ces
in our
moments de
own
souffrance
nation,
pour les Israéliens et les
united
Palestiniens afin d'œuvrer
in
sans
sharing the
relâche
suffering of
pour répondre
Israelis and
aux
Palestinians,
aspirations à la paix et à la sécurité de tous.
and
au
to stand by
Proche-Orient.
all those who seek peace and security in the Middle East.
Betaraim,
Betaraim,
dit-on en Israël,
we say in
pour
Israel,
désigner les cimetières,
to speak of a cemetery,
la maison de la vie.
the house of life.
Car pour ceux qui restent,
For those who remain,
leur vie sera faite
their lives
de ces absences.
will be made of
Une
absence,
vie différente,
a different
un
life,
monde différent,
a different world,
à l'aune du souvenir.
full of remembrance.
Et nous avons dès lors à habiter
And we
ce
now
deuil,
must live with
non
this
pas comme une
grief,
victoire de la mort,
not as a victory
mais
over
comme une
death,
invitation
but as an
à leur
invitation
trouver une place dans nos vies.
to find room for
Et ils sont là
those who have lost their
chacune et
lives
chacun,
in our life today.
pour nous rappeler que nos vies,
Each
leur
of
vie
these
mérite sans relâche de
victims
nous battre
remind
contre
us
les
that
idées de
their
haine,
lives, our
de ne
lives,
rien
are
céder
worth
à un
constantly fighting
antisémitisme
against
rampant,
hatred, against the
désinhibé,
growing
ici comme
anti-Semitism
là-bas,
which has
car rien ne le
been
justifie,
growing
rien,
here
car
and
rien
in
ne
the Middle
saurait
East, because
justifier
nothing
ni excuser
can
ce
justify
terrorisme,
or excuse
rien.
terrorism. Nothing.
Alors nous nous tenons là,
So we stand here today,
4 mois après,
4 months after,
devant ces visages et ces chaises,
with these faces and these empty chairs,
bouleversés de tristesse,
filled with
aux côtés des
sadness,
familles de ceux qui ne sont plus,
standing with the families who have lost precious
chargés
members,
d'affection,
full
aux côtés de ceux
of
qui soignent leurs
affection
blessures,
for those who are tending to their
et ne cédant
wounds
rien pour
and
ramener
refusing to
ceux qui
yield
sont encore là-bas.
until we can bring the hostages home.
Sentiments mêlés que nous vivons ensemble.
We have very mixed feelings at this moment as we stand here
Regardant ces
together,
visages,
because as we look at these
nous
faces,
savons
we know
que nous ne sommes pas juste
that we are
68
not
millions
only
en
68
ce jour.
million people today,
Nous sommes beaucoup plus.
but many, many more.
Un peuple
A people
épris de liberté,
in love
de
with
fraternité,
liberty,
de dignité.
fraternity, dignity,
Un peuple
a people
qui ne les oubliera jamais.
who will not forget these victims, ever.
Vive la République.
Vive la
la
République,
France.
vive la France.
You were just listening to the French President Emmanuel Macron at a commemoration which Paris held for the victims of the terror attacks in Israel on the 7th of October. 42 French citizens were killed by Hamas, and 3 remain hostage in Gaza. That is why you had 3 empty chairs, as the president mentioned there. France 24's Oliver Farry is on set with me, as well as Joseph Downing, senior lecturer in politics at Aston University. Oliver, I want to bring you in because we heard there from the French President Emmanuel Macron, extremely somber. Even the tone of voice, which he typically has, was not there today. He was very somber, very sad, saying France will never forget what happened. Spoke a lot about anti-Semitism in this country and the rise in anti-Semitism, which we have witnessed since the 7th of October.
Yeah, the government's expressed intention was to have this ceremony as part of a fight against anti-Semitism, and he very much spoke about that. One thing that was quite interesting was that he did say that even though a lot of these victims were not born in France, they were French, and this is probably circumscribed within the tradition of anti-Semitism in a lot of Western countries, which sees Jewish citizens as being, loyal to either themselves or loyal to another country. This is, in a way, Emmanuel Macron met that head on. He subverted it. He said that even though they were born and died under foreign skies, they were French. So, but he also made it not too sort of overwhelming in that sense, because he did say he wanted to avoid division in France. And he did have, however brief, a mention for the suffering of Palestinians as well. He did say it. He said that the Hamas attack did not mask the suffering of Palestinians. A lot of Palestinian supporters would say that that's insufficient, but he certainly was not speaking only of Israel during this ceremony.
Joseph Downing, I'd like to bring you in because there you heard from the French president. He of course spoke about the loss which France has witnessed with these 42 citizens that have died in these October 7th attacks. Do you think what Emmanuel Macron says can sort of bridge divisions which we have seen in France, which have broken out since the 7th of October?
I think Macron did a very good job there of attempting to bring the country together by, attempting to sort of commemorate, the loss of French Jewish lives in this attack, but also speaking of, the suffering of the Palestinians. I mean, not to be a cynic, but I doubt this is going to be enough, frankly, right? We are constantly bombarded on social media, on mainstream news media, of the horrors that are coming out of the Gaza Strip. Currently, and it's not really until, peace is brought to the Israel-Palestinian conflict that we're going to see these divisions begin to heal. And as I said, unfortunately, in medium to long term, I don't see that happening. The two-state solution seems unviable, more unviable than ever, because of Israeli settlements in the West Bank. See, Hamas on October the 7th has done irreparable damage to the Palestinian cause, right? Sources tell me that senior Palestinian negotiators were horrified by the attack, saw it really as a blow to their standing and to their cause internationally. However, also the response of the Netanyahu government in the bombing of Gaza and the settlements in the West Bank in the past, 10 or so years, has also done irreparable damage to Israel, to Israeli legitimacy, and to really the founding ideals of a Jewish state founded on democratic principles. And unfortunately, I don't see an easy way out of this conundrum, right? I mean, it's really, really sad and really, really tragic. It seems to be peace in the Middle East has been a very long time until that peace is restored, potentially as they will in most other countries that have, Jewish minorities, not faith.
Oliver, I'd like to bring you in because, of course, Emmanuel Macron kept he repeatedly said the barbaric attack which Israel witnessed on the 7th of October. Clearly, France has been under pressure by a lot of members of the Muslim community in this country for not doing enough to talk about the suffering of what's going on in Gaza. We had the French president that called for ceasefire in this conflict some over 30 days after it broke out, and 7,000 people had already died in the enclave. And recently, of course, we had France that was one of the countries in the West that has cut funding to UNRWA, the UN's Agency for Palestinian Refugees, at a critical moment when that organization is much needed in the enclave.
Yeah, there are definitely probably gaps between what France does and what France says at times. As I said earlier, France has definitely got a nuanced position on Israel and Palestine. It's not quite as unreservedly pro-Israeli as, for instance, the United States or Germany would be. But certainly there are. It definitely does lean a little bit more sympathetically towards Israel, and I think a large part of this is, as with a lot of European countries, is that they are very, very conscious of the history of European anti-Semitism, and even though sometimes, like certainly Benjamin Netanyahu is not popular with much of the European political class. He's not even very popular with the current US government either. But they will not abandon Israel simply because they don't particularly like the current Israeli government. They are worried about anti-Semitic attacks, which have happened with alarming frequency over the past decade in Europe, and especially in France, in Toulouse in 2013, and also in Paris at Hypercacher attacks in 2015.
I want to talk about that because he did sort of draw similarities between what we witnessed here in Paris in October 2015 as well. He mentioned Hypercacher. You're talking about Hypercacher, Cacher, pardon. The French supermarket, but the kosher supermarket rather. But the French President Emmanuel Macron spoke about the Bataclan, the November 2015 attacks, and he drew parallels with what happened at that festival in the south of Israel on the 7th of October.
Yeah, this is actually something that Israel itself has been saying since October 7th as well. It has been drawing a very clear parallel between the Bataclan and the music festival that happened on October 7th. This is, in a way, it's trying to put Hamas and the Islamic State group on the same level, so to speak. I mean, certain people would argue with that, but there's no denying that the attack of October 7th was shocking and barbaric in pretty much a similar way to the attack on the Bataclan was. This was also his way of bringing the October 7th attack and the death of 42 French citizens into a wider continuum of terrorist attacks against, both Jews and non-Jews in France over the past decade.
France 24's James Andre is standing by at the Invalides, and we can go across to him now. James, talk us through the atmosphere where you are as this ceremony wraps up.
Yeah, well, the atmosphere is very much one of great sadness and great respect of the people here, of course, who have been looking on as Emmanuel gave that very emotional speech, very much talking about these French victims of these attacks on the 7th of October, describing what their lives were, describing this attack, also trying to show it in all its. And this is very much a word that the president has used over and over again during this speech. It's barbarism, saying that indeed France would stand in the path of barbarism anywhere, and that indeed violence needed to be fought, and that this would be France's position, also saying that these attacks could not be excused or justified. So, very much an atmosphere of a lot of emotion here. And as you can see, well, the president now speaking with the families who are present here, have been flown in specially for this event. And of course, as you can hear, the music being played right now, which is Frédéric Chopin's funeral march.
And James, I want to talk about, you mentioned the atmosphere we've seen today, but I want to talk about the atmosphere in the country as a whole since the 7th of October, because of course, yes, France does have a sizable Jewish population, Jewish community that has lived here, but it also has a sizable Arab and Muslim community, and the events of the 7th of October have made France's stance over what has happened between Israel and Hamas rather divisive.
Yeah, well, indeed, it's always, we see this every time there is a tension that flares up in the Middle East between Israel and Palestine, and indeed this has happened again. You've got to remember that France is home to the largest Muslim community in Europe. That's about 5 million people.
Dana, tell him to wait 10 minutes.
As well, that's around 600,000. And indeed, yes, always when there is this situation, when indeed these gruesome attacks on the 7th of October, and then very strong retaliation by the Israelis. You've got to remember there are, over 26,000 people killed inside the Gaza Strip, according to Hamas. Well, that, of course, means that both communities there is tension that flares up, and we can actually see that very much in France. And this is the sense of this ceremony today also politically for Emmanuel Macron, is to show very clearly that France condemns these attacks that are qualified by the French authorities as terrorist attacks, and the president said it cannot be justified, cannot be explained, and need to be condemned in the strongest possible terms. This is very much the message the Elysee is conveying here, along with the fact that the French authorities do not want to see anti-Semitism flare up inside the country, because that, of course, is very clearly a risk given the tension we have now and this ongoing pounding of the Gaza Strip with the humanitarian situation that it entails. So yes, the objective here today is very much to show, for the president, is very much to show that the country stands united in the face of anti-Semitism, and that France is, backing Israel and doing everything to have its remaining hostages released from the Gaza Strip and from the hands of Hamas.
Stay with us, James. I'd like to bring in Joseph Downing now, because Joseph, as the ceremony takes place, clearly people around the world will notice that France has been one of the first countries to actually pay tribute to the victims of the October 7th attack. I'm curious how this is going to be viewed in the Arab world, where there have been accusations of double standards, clearly from the likes of Queen Rania. How do you think that's going to be perceived?
Yeah, there's a long-standing and, in some ways, reasonably accurate narrative in the Arab and the broader Muslim world, as is often discussed, also in Europe and the US, in terms of there being a double standard when it comes to Israel and Palestine, where, Israeli lives are valued more than Palestinian ones, that Israelis, because they're somehow closer to Europeans, are seen as more valuable than Palestinian lives, despite the actual reality that 40 to 50% of Israel's population are of non-European Jewish origin, so from the Middle East, North Africa, Ethiopia, Iran, and Uzbekistan, and places like that. And I think this is one of the really sad aspects of this current conflict is, already Israel and its Western backers and Western allies did not have the best reputation in those parts of the world, and I think this has really emboldened a narrative that, there is hypocrisy in the West, in that, Palestinian lives are not valued as much as Israeli lives, that Europe, North America and Israel are not serious about a peace process to build a viable two-state solution to give Palestinians independence. And as your previous commentator said, there's a difference between what states say and what states actually do. And I think the problem, here really is the West Bank settlements. This is really the stumbling block to a viable two-state solution, and a stumbling block that has not just appeared in the past few months, one that has been 10 years in the making. And until people get serious, whether it's states or Israel or Israeli government themselves, about coming to terms with the fact that a two-state solution is required, I think that those accusations of hypocrisy are going to look ever more credible.
But we've also seen the president's stance shift over Israeli actions, because naturally we're going to have domestic pressure over in Israel on the prime minister there to do whatever it takes to secure the release of hostages. Clearly, France has 3 hostages it wants to see brought back as well. I'm just curious. Emmanuel Macron in the past has questioned Prime Minister Netanyahu's goal on eliminating Hamas. He even said that could take 10 years. Does he really see eye to eye with the Israeli Prime Minister at all?
I don't think there are many heads of state, frankly, that see eye to eye with Netanyahu, as there are not many Israelis, I don't think, that see eye to eye with Netanyahu. Netanyahu's own defense minister apparently is no longer on speaking terms with Netanyahu over his conduct prior to and then after the October the 7th attacks. I mean, this is a deeply unpopular, corrupt politician, right? And this is someone who's not popular in many quarters at all. And this is the thing that makes Israel under Netanyahu a very difficult partner to do business with diplomatically, because it's very difficult to gain any kind of leverage or to really speak a language of peace with a head of state that realistically has little to no interest in building a sustainable peace in the Middle East. I think the structural, historians will look back at the structural barriers that the Netanyahu government successively have put in place to a two-state solution, which may, I think, render the two-state solution even unviable. But what comes next, right? Clearly, occupation, repression, the situation that we see on the ground is untenable in the long term. I mean, it's already been in place now for, several decades, but at some point something is going to shift. And I'm quite pessimistic about the prospects for, Saudi Arabia today has come out and said that it won't formalize diplomatic relations with Israel until there is a viable Palestinian state created. But the reality on the ground shows that is not possible. But what comes next? Do we see, Palestinians granted Israeli citizenship and voting rights? I doubt it, because then that would be kind of the end of the Jewish state. And so there's a real impasse here and a real problem to know how to move forward.
That's an interesting point. I'd like to bring in Oliver once again. Oliver, finally, a final question to you, because as France wraps up this ceremony, we do have the US's top diplomat, Anthony Blinken, who is in Israel today on the four-month anniversary of the Hamas attacks, and he's trying to push for a ceasefire deal, which was hashed out here in Paris.
Yeah, there has been some encouraging signs from Qatar, who are saying that Hamas is responsive to this ceasefire, that some countries have actually hoped that it might go for several weeks. Whether Israel is going to agree to that, we do not know as of yet. I mean, for some of Hamas's demands are quite high. They want a lot of fairly high-profile, hardened terrorists released from Palestinian prisons. This is quite different from the prisoner for hostage exchange that took place in November, for instance, when they were women and teenagers. Whereas there will be, this is a lot more, and even Joe Biden said that it was unrealistic what they're asking for.
Thank you very much.
So they probably won't be met, but there might be sort of like further slicing of the sausage, so to speak, in order to get in order to get the two parties in agreement, and that we might have a ceasefire for at least perhaps a week, if not longer, and we can get both hostages released from Gaza, and obviously Hamas will get what it wants as well.
Thank you very much for that, Oliver Farry there from our International Affairs Desk, as well as Joseph Downing. That's it for this edition. Thank you very much for watching.